Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, June 27th, and how are you feeling? What do we want to talk about today?
Well, there's so much to talk about. I guess the focus of my attention has remained on the Middle East. In particular the Israel-Iran conflict. Of course, other things are going on. There's the NATO summit. Some interesting things happened there, but for the most part, I think I think the we need to continue discussing Israel and Iran, though not exclusively. We can go on to other things as well.
Yeah. Well, how are you feeling just about this whole? I feel strange. This whole ceasefire. It just everything just feels so fake about this conflict, this 12-day conflict. The narratives that are being pushed out, and I feel like the U.S. administration's in a bit of a bind because they're just doubling down on this idea that we completely destroyed Iran's nuclear capabilities. And they came to that conclusion very, very quickly. We're not seeing the evidence. And if it turns out that it's not true, like, okay, even if you destroyed the facilities, well, you didn't answer the question about what happened to the enriched uranium. Has it moved? Iran has the knowledge still, they have the capability. And then there's this whole question about them withdrawing from the NPT. So that seems to be the big impetus. And this is going to be the catalyst to start the war again, is to say, like, look, you did not destroy their, nuclear enrichment capabilities. And this is, the U.S. has gone all in on that this is,
Right.
Trump has made this red line, no nukes, no enrichment for Iran.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, it's the pretext for this war was their civilian enrichment program. In particular, the uranium that had been enriched to 60%. So, if on the one hand, if you claim that you've completely obliterated the program, they've been set back, many years, and we've heard statements like that to that effect from the U.S. and some from Israeli officials, but mainly from the U.S. and Trump in particular. Then you have deprived yourself of a pretext for further war, or you're just going to invent another one. I think it's going to be hard to do. There was already, a good deal of skepticism about this first attack. Let's be clear. Before it happened, there was a clear majority within the U.S. against it. I think even after it happened, there still was a majority. There was this strong support among Republicans, it must be said, but there still was, a majority who viewed it negatively. So anyway, that puts you use this once, it's just like it's like using an excuse for not going to work or something, as my grandmother died or whatever. You can't use it again, right? You can't do it again. Or it's going to be very, very hard. And the people were skeptical to begin with. Now, you see there is another voice, that is being heard. The Trump administration is adamant about the success of that mission. But I think just yesterday, or it may even have been, this morning, that the defense minister of Israel Katz, said that they had failed to, they had done damage to the facilities, but that the enriched uranium was still there, and that would have to be handed over. And so now you're hearing this, these statements coming from various officials saying that, for Iran to have peace, they must hand over that uranium. And I think maybe that's what we're going to hear louder and louder over time, and that will be the new pretext. We destroyed your facilities, but we need your uranium, and if you don't do it, we'll have to attack you again. Again, it's going to be it's going to be difficult. But I wouldn't say that these people are incapable of doing it. They don't really need much of an excuse to launch an attack on another country.
Yeah, there's no international law broken here or anything like this for
No.
Iran to hand over the uranium. This is their uranium. There's nothing illegal what they've done. Is that true?
Right. That's true. Right. That's something that the Iranians and others have pointed out. Enriching uranium to 60% is completely legal, under the NPT. And the IAEA admits that too. Now, it's legal, but it does clearly provide you with a breakout capability. And so that was used. I think some people have said that that was a mistake, that Iran shouldn't have enriched it to that point, because that gave Israel and the U.S. an excuse to attack them. Again, it's not a sound justification for it. Again, what they did was entirely legal, and it was being monitored, very extensively by the IAEA. One thing that we have to remember, even though they were outside of the JCPOA, they were under intensive monitoring by the IAEA, much more intense than for other countries in the world. Iran's nuclear facilities only account for 3% of all the nuclear facilities that are monitored by the IAEA, but they were receiving 20% of the monitoring. So it was, approximately 7 times, the intensity of monitoring going on there. Now you can say, well, there's always this, you can't prove a negative. Maybe they have something secret somewhere else. But if there's any country, that you should be assured is not involved in, pursuing a nuclear weapon, it's Iran. There's no country that's more heavily monitored. So this justification, in spite of the fact that they did what was quite legal, and they went to 60%, this was a very heavily monitored, program. And if they were going to take the step to go to weapons grade, everybody would know about it. I mean, because again, the IAEA was there on the ground. Now, why did they enrich to 60%? And I think it's clear they saw it as a bargaining chip. If they had stayed down at 3.67% or whatever that is normal for operating a nuclear power plant, that in that case, well, they wouldn't really have anything to bargain with. The U.S. would come in and say, we demand this and that, and but they wouldn't have anything to give up, But with this, they can say, okay, yeah, we've got the 60%. We could take that, or we can have that sent to Russia, in a secure location, which, or some other internationally monitored location. We'll do that. We'll make that concession. And you can make your own concessions or something, they have something to work with. And I think there's no question about it that that's the way they're reviewing it, as a bargaining chip. Now, some people say that, again, this was maybe a mistake because it provoked Israel and the U.S. into attacking them. I don't think it really made any difference. This program was, the nuclear program, which is a civilian enrichment, program. That was entirely, or it wasn't entirely, let's say it was largely a pretext for this attack. It wasn't the reason. I think, again, it is regime change. It's trying to give Iran the Syria treatment. They were trying to bring about the downfall of the government, and they wanted to see Iran plunge into chaos. And this gave them, a pretext. Now, it's not entirely a pretext. I think there actually is a concern on the part of the Israelis about this program. I think John Mearsheimer, pointed this out. He said a previous prime minister of Israel, Yehu Barak, had said that, well, if I were Iran, I would definitely develop a nuclear weapon. That it's in their interest, and he just sees that that's the logic. And I think that's the way that they looked at it. Maybe you could say it's a certain amount of projection, but there is a logic there. Yeah, a lot of people saying, why don't they get one? And I think the Israelis, on some level, were thinking, well, they have this capability. At some point, they're going to make the decision. And so it'd be good to take out the program because it really makes sense for them to do that. Well, why does it make sense? Because you're always threatening them, right? But so, they ought to look in the mirror, when they make these arguments. But I think sometimes I think we go too far and say that this was nothing but a pretext. It was all about regime change. I don't think that's really true. It is partly about the nuclear program itself, but I think it's largely a pretext. The main goal, the overriding objective was really regime change, so-called. So anyway, Yeah, I think I answered your question. I kind of forget what it was at this point, but
For a fundamental problem, though, of having the narrative just be about the nuclear program of Iran, like this is the pretext for war and bombing Iran again, is that just the hypocrisy, just the glaring hypocrisy, the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons and is not a signatory of the NPT, does not allow any IAEA inspections. Whereas, like you were just saying, Iran has been subjected to 7 times the amount of IAEA inspections than average. And they are a signatory of the NPT. They haven't violated anything. And they are being demanded, you're going to say, probably to give up their enriched uranium by a country that is not a signatory to any of these international bodies, doesn't obey the law, actually has nuclear weapons that it's not supposed to have, is making this demand, give up your enriched uranium. And I just think the fact that that's true and more people are going to understand that and realize it, the hypocrisy is just going to become more and more apparent for people, especially if Iran comes back and makes a demand saying like, okay, we will give you up our enriched uranium, but that means Israel has to denuclearize as well. We know that Israel has nuclear weapons. It's in everybody's interest to have a denuclearized Middle East. And I think if they push that narrative out there, I think that's something that everybody can be aware of. Because also people are afraid, we made a video a couple of months ago about the Samson option. And, we didn't get a lot of views. And then just recently, I've been seeing that video has been doing better and getting more and more because people are searching for the Samson option. People are aware of it and they're aware of this threat that Israel poses to the world. So how do you think this is going to play out for Israel? If they try to say, give up your enriched uranium, will that work?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, it won't work. I don't see Iran giving it up. They have been adamant about their completely legal nuclear program for decades now, as they have every right to be. There's a sovereign nation. I think for sovereignty is a sacred concept for the Iranians. It seems like, that's really what they're about from the beginning. We will not be a vassal state. We will not bend our knee, to the foreigners. We are a sovereign nation. And they, so that's part of it. Here we have this program that's entirely legal. Yeah, sure, in theory, you could give it up, right? But in giving that up, you're giving up a piece of your sovereignty. And it's like, having another country demand, we don't like your railroads. We want you to use highways instead. We don't like this kind of infrastructure. They have no right to do that. If you did it, you say, yeah, maybe we could do better. But we're not going to do that because another country demands it. That's the beginning of the loss of our sovereignty. There will be other demands that fall. So I don't see them doing that. I don't think it's possible that they're going to do that.
Would they do it, though, if they say Israel gives up its nuclear program? Then they'd be the heroes of the world.
Yeah, well, that's a possibility. We can see maybe that would be an intelligent response. I think that could be a very effective response. And then just on the glaring double standard, I think it's even greater than that. I mean, I've just been sickened by the statements or lack of statements from the IAEA over this. The IAEA, what it is, the deal is you say, I don't develop nuclear weapons. Our country won't do it. We're going to submit ourselves to the inspections, but with that, we make ourselves legal, and it's all recognized, by this international organization, by the countries of the world, that we have a legal program that deserves, that is protected against law, under law, and it should be protected by this agency. Now, first of all, we have every reason to suspect that IAEA was working very closely with Israel to begin with and may have provided him with a lot of information on nuclear scientists and so on and so forth. But even if, let's just set that aside for now, 14 nuclear scientists were assassinated. These are the people, this is the, IAEA is, it's kind of an international professional organization. It's for nuclear science. It's kind of like, the AMA and doctors on one level. I know it's more than that, but these are their colleagues, and these are people that were engaged. They themselves have demonstrated were engaged in a civilian, peaceful pursuit of this science, which they're the body that oversees this. I never heard one statement, from Grossi about these assassinations, these murders. It was worse than that. Not only did they kill these scientists, but often they killed the scientist and his entire family. I think the last one they killed, it was the scientist. He was a mid-level nuclear scientist too. Somebody who's not famous or anything, but he was shared an apartment with his father-in-law, mother-in-law, his wife, and 3 children. And they were all killed together with him. And again, the IAEA never made a statement. They never condemned Israel's attack, which were clearly war crimes. And the sort of thing, again, the IAEA is there to prevent, right? We have monitored these. These are peaceful. These are IAEA monitored facilities. You have attacked them. This is where they have to come out and do their part. Okay, Iran did their part, right? They've submitted to this very intensive monitoring. IAEA, you do your part. You say you condemn these attacks. They just made some sort of, vague condemnation of attacks in general. They refused to mention Israel by name, but it's like as though there were any doubt. They didn't do it, and I just find that, sickening. Really, just truly sickening. Other countries, I know the Russians in particular, have really gone after the IAEA because they've had their own experiences with them. This is an institution that is now just a tool, a weapon, of Western hegemony. And that's a very disturbing development, again, because they are a very important part of the NPT regime. And if it's clear that they're corrupted, the NPT is in real trouble.
Right. Yeah, it's just showing that all these international international bodies, we always kind of knew that they were tools of the West, but if anybody had any doubts, now it's made clear, they're all just parts of Western hegemony. And so if they withdraw from the NPT, though, do you think that's something that Iran actually will do? Because if they do that, will that be potentially the pretext, the trigger to start the war again? All of a sudden,
it could be. That's the danger of withdrawing from it. If they make the decision, everyone's always said if they make the decision to go for a bomb, that would be like the first step, is you withdraw from the NPT.
Right. Well, if Iran is accusing the IAEA of actually helping Israel assassinate their scientists, and then and also producing this finding a day before the attack to give the pretense, the legitimacy for this sneak attack. It's clear that they don't want IAEA anywhere around their facilities. So if they don't allow them, then does that mean they're out of the NPT? It's like you don't have inspections.
Not quite. Yeah, they have already, I think their parliament, the Iranian political system is very complicated. There are a lot of different kind of overlapping institutions, but they have formally, officially suspended their relationship with the IAEA. They haven't ended, they haven't withdrawn from the NPT, but they have suspended their relationship with the IAEA. And it seems, again, that it would be foolish not to. And then Grossi, the head of the IAEA, is, then he comes out with a strong statement that they must let us inspect. They must let us know where this enriched uranium is. And he said, yeah, right. Why would they allow the IAEA in? I think it's just there almost seems to be a complete lack of self-awareness even on the part of these people. I think they're just so used to having kind of this sense of superiority that they kind of expect other countries to grovel, and they seem to be surprised when they don't.
Are you surprised by the lack of condemnation coming from the West? Not talking about the United States, but just Europe in general, when you have such a clear act of aggression that Israel carried out against Iran, in the midst of these negotiations, a sneak attack that targeted not only military leaders, but politicians and scientists, assassinations, terrorism, car bombings. Negotiators. Right. This is what happened. It's like clearly, everybody knows that this isn't okay. That you don't do this in war, that this is a very heinous act. I understand the United States and the Zionist control, but I felt like Europe, they would be able to speak out against something like this, including, or just the attacks on the nuclear facilities. Like, we don't want another Chernobyl, right? This is bad.
Right.
You're not supposed to bomb nuclear facilities. Like, this is something we could easily to condemn. Also, the populations within Europe, there isn't a strong Christian Zionist element like there is in the United States. So I just felt like this isn't popular position to be so pro-Israel in Europe as well. But are you surprised that your Europeans, they just kowtow, they just kind of repeat what the United States says, they just offer these blank platitudes,
right?
They don't do what's in their own interest, like condemn this would make you popular, people understand it's not good for the world, let's don't do this, let's don't bomb nuclear sites.
I'm sorry to say I wasn't surprised. I mean, it's just that the governments, again, not particularly representative of their respective peoples, but the governments are just thoroughly in line with this. They're very closely aligned with Israel, and just can reflexively support their actions. We're beginning to get some criticisms of the enforced starvation in Gaza towards the end there, and then that was forgotten. But there was no realignment, let's say. There was really no fundamental change in the support for Zionism among Western governments. So I wasn't surprised by it. There was a little bit of criticism voiced, regarding the attacks on the nuclear facilities. But then, but I think there's really no criticism about the American attack on the 3 nuclear facilities. One thing that it shows too is just like, there was a lot of criticism of Donald Trump prior to that attack. He actually wants to talk to the Russians. This is horrifying, right? So there was all sorts of consternation and protest regarding, Trump's measures towards, negotiations and possibly peace, peace breaking out, the horror. But then when he goes and attacks, on a completely, without justification, without provocation, on a pretext, he attacks these facilities. There's nothing but praise, and you saw he got a hero's welcome. I mean, it was. I'm sure you maybe saw that message from Rutte that he had sent to Trump. Trump then published it. It was just so sycophantic, and this is what he got. He got that treatment. He got that sycophantic treatment when he went to this NATO summit. Why? Because he was a war president. He had attacked another country. I've told you about what happened during his first term when he attacked Syria. Before that, it was just day in and day out. Everything that Trump said and did was awful, and it was condemned. He used the wrong word here. We opposed his policy there, and it was never ending. But then he attacked. Again, it was on a false pretense. He attacked Syria, and then all of a sudden, we have ourselves. He has now proven himself to be a proper commander in chief. So what can you say, what conclusion can you draw from that? And that is that these people love war. They love war when it's, exercised or it's waged by their leader, the U.S.
Well, I mean, I understand how NATO would love war. It's part of the military-industrial complex. But the political elite, people like Starmer and Macron, Merz, why would they be happy about the U.S. attacking Iran? I mean, if a conflict did start up between Iran and Israel, that the U.S. is going to definitely be pulling out of any support of Ukraine, which seems to be the most important thing for the Europeans. Nothing makes sense. You can always count on the Europeans to root for the wrong thing. That just seems to be true. I just don't understand. It's never not in their interest. Blow up the Nord Stream pipeline. Hurrah. This is great. Let's support, anything. They just take the unpopular stance. I just don't understand. Right. Why?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, in the case of Israel, when Israel launches the attack, they just cannot oppose Israel. This is, this is where, this is part of who they are now. Even though, they don't have, there aren't very many Jewish Zionists in Europe, not like, in contrast to the U.S. They're Christian Zionism basically does not exist in Europe. They're not subject to the same forces. Yet, the political elite, that's just part of becoming the political elite. Is supporting Israel. That's part of the kind of the unspoken, you could say maybe even, creed of these people, that we support Israel. That's one line of their creed.
Really?
And yeah, well, I mean, that's what you've seen. Can you find any, real exceptions? That's just
I don't know. It just seems
it's
weird.
Extraordinary, but it is. Of course it is. It's very strange.
Who's cultivating these elite? How do they do it? They just...
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it is actually through the U.S. I think Europe, there's no question. It's not that I think, but Europe 20 years ago was more independent. You think about what happened, for example, during the Iraq War and the lead up to the Iraq War. The French actually opposed it, quite openly and forcefully. And so there we had our freedom fries and all that nonsense, and all those, jokes about cheese-eating surrender monkeys and because the French opposed it, right? Because at that time, Europe was actually semi-independent. And it had been semi-independent, during previous decades too. Like previous chancellors had pursued Ostpolitik, and with an improvement of relations with the Soviet Union, even when it made the Americans nervous because they saw it in their own interest. But really, ever since that first Iraq War, well, I think it's really in great part due to American pressure. America has a lot of levers, to pull in relation to Europe. They have, and over time, the neocons won in Europe. And so now you have leaders, you have establishments, you have governments in Europe that are just, that share the American view of the world, the neocon version of the world. And dissent has disappeared. It's just, it exists in a couple of countries. There are a few opposition parties, but within these governments, it's just of the major countries there, it has disappeared. And that's extraordinary. It's hard, it's hard to just say, well, that's, the Americans did this. There obviously had to be some sort of weakness, within European society, some kind of apathy, a failure to fight back, There are people back then that saw, oh, this is not good. Even people like Merkel, kind of had an understanding that she's kind of a transition figure. She was, she's part of that transition to total subservience. But, initially she thought it was a big mistake, for example, for Ukraine to be brought into NATO, rightly, and others. But all of that was, those protests were weak. They were just overcome by American insistence. There wasn't really a will to independence. Even though they saw that these certain American policies were not in their interest. In the end, they bowed to the Americans, and that's what you have now. You have totally subservient states in Europe.
Do you think that neocon thinking is really deeply entrenched already? Because like you said, it was only 20 years ago where we were doing the freedom fries and all that stuff. It seems like there was some independence. Overall, this is a relatively new phenomenon. Is there a chance that Europe can take their continent back and be like, okay, we are Germans. We have our own foreign policy, and we don't like having wars in the Middle East. We don't want to have, just why?
Well, there is a chance. Sometimes, I'm more hopeful about Europe because you do have, well, first of all, there are some true dissident countries, right? And we have Slovakia and Hungary. Some other
Hungary's
governments
very supportive of Israel, though, I would say.
I know. Well, I was going to get to that. When it comes to Russia and some other policies, right, they are independent. Unfortunately, the great majority of these populist parties are very supportive of Israel. They've made a devil's bargain with Israel. And so if they come to power, if we see the National Rally, come to power in France, actually, the National Rally is, I think, it's so, it's treated with such horror by the establishment that you imagine it must be, really kind of a hardcore party, but it isn't. Under Marine Le Pen, they have made many compromises to the point that there's kind of milquetoast. I don't know that you would even see some really significant departures if the national rally came into power. I think the off day is a different question. Different matter, I should say, entirely. If they came to power, I think, again, you can be disappointed. You think you're voting for a real change of policy, and then you get the same thing. But I think you would see a real change in policy vis-a-vis Russia, but not, unfortunately, vis-a-vis Israel and the Middle East.
Yeah, this Zionist grip of the Western world is just unbelievable, and it seems like it was a lot of it is manufactured in the United States, and we kind of spread it out to the rest of the Western world, and it's corrupted everything. I don't know, but it's being exposed, and it's going to crumble down, and it's going to get a little wild. I don't know what's going to happen. I want to move over a little bit to Gaza, though,
Okay.
because I'm hearing. Is there a ceasefire happening? I've been hearing rumors about some deal, and that Hamas is going to be exiled, and there's going to be a new political party under control of Saudi Arabia and some other country. I don't know if this is true. Do you know what's going on here?
There's talk about that. I don't know. I don't see that happening. I don't know where that's coming from and what that's based on. I think it sounds like. The idea is it's some new expanded version of the Abraham Accords. I think they call it like Abraham's Shield or something like that. And it would mean the idea is that just some combination of Middle Eastern powers, like Saudi Arabia and maybe Egypt and a couple of the Gulf states, would actually administer Gaza. Hamas would surrender power. I guess some Hamas leaders would simply leave the territory. And Gazans would be encouraged to emigrate. We don't know exactly what that means. And then there would be a normalization of relations between, for example, these different countries, including Syria, where we have Mr. Al-Qaeda, Mr. ISIS in charge. There would be a normalization of relations between them and Israel. And I think that's the kind of the general sketch, the outline of this deal. I just don't see that happening. I think that I don't see why it would happen. Within Gaza, the carnage continues. Nothing has really changed. Our focus was shifted elsewhere. But we see the same things. In fact, there was some sort of relief being provided in northern Gaza. It's in southern Gaza largely, where we have this mysterious NGO, that's likely funded by the Mossad, distributing limited amounts of humanitarian aid. But almost virtually every day, people are being gunned down. Aid seekers are being gunned down, and this is not just Hamas saying this. I read this morning an article in Haaretz. It's the IDF soldiers are saying this. Some of the IDF soldiers have gone to Haaretz and said, "Look, we're being told these are not, just." Incidents of maybe some rogue soldiers or some situations that got out of control. But this is basically policy. We're being told by our officers to shoot at these people. And, he described many different horrifying incidents. These poor people, a lot of times they don't know where they're supposed to stand because the rules keep on changing. They come in at night because they're supposed to, the distribution's supposed to start at dawn, and maybe they stand on the wrong side of the line. So what do the IDF soldiers just start shooting at them? They don't send tear gas or provide warnings. They just start shooting at them. That's just what the IDF soldiers themselves were saying. So this is going on. This hasn't changed. The horror, has not ended anywhere or even really slowed down within Gaza. It continues. And I don't see Saudi Arabia. Well, first of all, Saudi Arabia, I think, understands these governments are corrupt and they just don't care about the Palestinians, let's be honest. But they know that many of their people do, and that it would be a very dangerous move to actually recognize Israel. So I don't think that these countries will do that. And then the other thing is that you're going to have a group of Arab countries administering Gaza, Well, I don't think the Israelis want that because so many of them really want to ethnically cleanse Gaza. It's going to be difficult if you have, Egyptian soldiers or, I don't know what they mean by administration exactly, but you have, the Egyptians and Saudi Arabians there. It will certainly throw a wrench in the works of the gears of ethnic cleansing. Um, yeah, I don't see it happening. I think it's wishful thinking. I think if it's attempted, it'll fail. Because again, you have people within Israel that don't want to see it happen. Um, but yeah, it's out there. There's
So is there any hope for Gaza? We're just back to
gosh,
just killing every day. We'll just slaughter Gazans, starve them, just make them live in horror. Like, it's
yeah. Well, that's right. I
amazing.
mean, it is. Yeah, there's no lessening of it. In fact, there's a certain amount of relief that came in, and I was just reading. This was like the IDF themselves said that okay, we had to do this because we didn't want to have a total collapse of legitimacy for Israel. They were starting to get these criticisms from Europe. They came very, very late, but they were starting to come. So anyway, by allowing a certain amount of aid, they staved off, a total collapse in support for Israel. But it's just, again, this aid is being done in conjunction with these massacres. It's very limited. The suffering continues. It may stave off starvation, for a certain period of time for a certain percentage of the population. Just the other day, I think in the north, there was some, international organizations were allowed to provide a limited amount of aid, but that has been cut off again, at the insistence, I believe, of Smotrich. And, so we're here. The things really haven't changed.
So what do you expect to happen? Is that we will continue to see Gazans suffer, and will there be a point where there's enough blood that has been shed in Gaza that somebody in the world will intervene, that we will see somebody step up, that we'll see sanctions coming from European countries? I mean, what's taking the ICJ so long? We had this, probable cause for
Yeah.
genocide, and it just disappeared. And then it's like, well, can we get a consensus? Like, everybody can agree that what's happening in Gaza is wrong. All right, like this
Right.
is not okay. If they come out with a genocide finding, and then it becomes irrefutable and we can take some real action. But I mean, surely we know that this is wrong, and it's bad for the whole Western world. Like we're saying, they're
Yeah.
losing all their soft power. Capital has evaporated because of
Yeah.
this, and they want to constantly vilify Russia, but they don't do anything about Israel and its aggression, where the Israel's killed more civilians than Ukraine and Russia combined in just a matter of a month, I think is what it was. They
Yeah.
killed more civilians than both armies in Europe have killed in 3 years. It's like, yeah, well, where do we go? Do we just keep it going? Will there be a breaking point?
Well, yeah, I think there must be a breaking point somewhere. It's hard to say when. I'm afraid that breaking point may be just will come too late. We have seen some people, finally um, cease defending Israel and actually join the critics of Israel. Like an example is Piers Morgan. He was an important figure in the media.
Well,
Yeah. Well, but
Piers
still,
is
I mean, I know it's not perfect. It's not perfect, but it is something. I mean, that he has actually really gone after. I've seen some of these interviews where he's gone after these Israeli officials, and it's imperfect. I know. I mean, he obviously has a lot of blind spots. I think he supported the attack on Iran and all that. But this is how these changes, especially in the initial stages, are incremental, right? It is a step in the right direction. Um,
Yeah, it
but
is a
you
big
can see
transformation. It's true
yeah,
for Pierce a year ago compared
yeah,
to now. When I talk about Gaza,
right,
it's very different. Yeah.
yeah, and if it happens to somebody like him, it's happening with other people, but we have a long ways to go. Now it's just yeah, there has to be a breaking point somewhere. I just don't know where it is. Breaking points are kind of very, very hard to predict. And when they happen, you keep them on thinking it should happen now, and it goes on and on. But then when it happens, it always takes you by surprise. I think, when it happens, it could be very, very fast. When, finally they say this is enough. But
what does that
yeah,
mean though when we hit a breaking point? We say this is enough. That the U.S. all of a sudden stops, or will there be a different entity like Russia or China that puts some type of stipulation? Or I mean,
yeah.
or do we just push it for?
Right. Yeah, you know what? I don't see any of these countries becoming militarily involved because they understand you become military involved, you're quickly going to be dealing with the U.S. and and you have the problem of the potential for World War III. But real economic pressure could be applied to Israel, by European countries and other countries in the world. And that really could make a difference. They are vulnerable in that sense. You know, but we're a long ways from that. Nothing has been, they've hardly had a slap on the wrist for what's happened
Well,
so far.
how badly is Israel hurting right now? Just after this, 12-day war where they were hit pretty hard with these Iranian
Yeah.
missiles.
Well, it was extremely costly. I mean, just if you look at like the expenditure of munitions, both the missiles that they fired, the aircraft that they had to keep running and keep in operation, almost continually, and then the air defense interceptors. It comes out to many hundreds of millions of dollars a day. I thought, I see different figures. I think the other day I just saw 200 million for the interceptors every day, and then but a larger number actually for the offensive part of their operation, and it comes close to $1 billion, like over $500 million a day. And for a small country like Israel, if it was just Israel, they could not keep that up, for very long at all. They don't have that capacity. Now, of course, they're being supported by the U.S., but that's still, even for the U.S., well, okay, the U.S. can keep on printing money, right? But at least for the time being. But they only have so many interceptors. They only have so many munitions. We understand that. So it was very costly in just pure military terms. But then also there were strikes on the port, and which led to closing. Not the entire closing down of the port in Haifa, but the major shipping line Maersk, suspended its operations there, and then of course the airport was largely shut down throughout. Yeah, and so its links to the world which had already, there's the port on the Red Sea that was shut down a long time ago because of the efforts of the Houthis, and is still not in operation. So this was a country that was, not entirely isolated, but which only has a few links, transportation links with the rest of the world, and these had been severely compromised by the attack. And then you had, attacks on like oil refineries that actually led to power outages and rolling blackouts. And these were, again, just sort of, it was just a taste of what I think Iran could, the blows that Iran could deal Israel. I don't know if anybody has actually totaled up the total economic damage. There were also, I think the Microsoft headquarters was hit, the Weizmann Institute, like the leading scientific research institution there in Israel, was hit and very severely damaged. I think it's probably just going to have to be entirely rebuilt. And all these things, this is all part, these kinds of institutions are part of Israel's advanced economic sector. It's part of the economic engine that keeps that allows Israel to prosper. And these all have been damaged, and they have to affect the calculations again of major corporations and into the future. They're going to have to reassess, the extent of their investment in Israel. It's hard to believe that they're going to maintain the current levels. That I think almost certainly they're going to scale back. So there was immediate damage, and I think, again, as we've said before, there's certainly long-term damage. There's just the
Right.
confidence that countries had, or corporations had in Israel. That was shaken prior to this recent war. Ever since October 7th, they just began to understand, Israel's not the kind of country that we thought it was. And then, this shows, and not only that, it's actually vulnerable to attack. We kind of assumed that it was always invincible. It always, dealt these devastating blows to its neighbors, but it never suffered any of these blows itself. And so Israel has ceased to be the country that it used to be, in the minds of many people, including investors and other political leaders around the world.
Right. I'm just wondering how easy it will be for them to rebuild the structures that were destroyed. Because who wants to invest in rebuilding the structure that may easily become the target again? There's a reason that these buildings were destroyed to begin with. These institutions that are pillars of Israeli society, like the Weizgarber Institute and, the ports, all this stuff. It's like, okay, they're badly damaged. We were talking about this current state as just a pause. This war is likely going to resume again. You're in the middle of construction, and then another ballistic missile is probably going to hit it, right? So who wants to fund that? Who wants to keep it going? I imagine the willingness to rebuild in Israel has got to be not that high if they're thinking about that. Just like we're spending all this time and money to rebuild something that could potentially just be shot again if this war starts up, and everybody thinks it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's, this is a sort of, this kind of reputational damage is damage that really cannot be repaired in the short or medium term. I mean, it's going to take many years, if not, decades to really repair it, to get people back to the place that they were before October 7th. Israel is a society here to stay. It's normal, it's healthy, it's stable. Everything that's happened now tells you, no, it's not stable. It's not really secure, and it's not normal. And, there will be people who, again, like corporate leaders, whatever they may be, they have their ideological side to them, but in the end, it's the bottom line. And you say, am I really going to risk, $1 billion in this country? I don't think so.
Right. Would you say then that it's fair to say that the world has fundamentally changed since this 12-day war? That it is something comparable to like October 7th or Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Are we in... Or is this kind of like step 2 after October 7th,
Yeah. Well, I guess it's part of it's a continuation of the trends that we've already seen. But I think one difference is Iran. I think the perception of Iran has changed, and for the better. Iran has been subject to, this slanderous propaganda campaign for decades and decades. And it really has affected perceptions of the country, from all around the world, even within the global south. And I think actually Iran's conduct during this war, they clearly were the victim. And they didn't collapse. They reconstituted themselves. They fought back and did real damage to the enemy. And I think that has changed the perception of Iran throughout the world, and maybe most importantly within the Middle East. There are these sectarian tendencies that we saw play out, for example, in Syria, the Sunnis versus the Shia, and of course the Iranians are Shia, and so there are segments of these societies that are very suspicious of Iran. But I think just seeing Iran, fight back, first be subject to this attack, really suffering under as a result of the Israeli surprise attack, and then inflicting real damage, has got to change their perceptions to an important degree. Say, okay, yeah, these people are for real. They really do oppose the Zionists. Sometimes you found, I'd hear of propaganda. It's like, the Iranians are just phonies. They're not really opposed to Zionists. I think that was always ridiculous. But now that line is which is propagated often by Sunni extremists, is really lost a lot of strength. Again, I'm just providing one example within the region, but in general, the perception of Iran has changed. And I think Iran's relationship, another important outcome was that their relationship, we'll see how it develops, but their relationship with Russia and China has got to change. I think that assuming that they're reasonable people, they have to understand that that they've already improved relations tremendously with these countries, but they have to go much further, to withstand the next wave of attacks. They need the help of Russia and China. So that will just further intensify again a trend that already existed, towards a kind of a quasi-alliance between these three countries. I think that's just going to grow stronger as a result of this.
Are you expecting to see some type of mutual defense pact between countries like Russia and Iran or China and Iran in the coming, days, maybe, or weeks before, the war starts back up again? And if that does, then that could just potentially put a cap on it and be like, well, okay, no war because China and Russia will get involved.
Right. I don't expect that. I think countries are usually reluctant to, it's not exactly in the middle of a war, but it almost is. I think it's a lull within a war, and I think countries are reluctant to make those kind of alliances in these kind of circumstances because, you really are asking for trouble. If you can do it during peacetime, and then and before the war breaks out, you can prevent war. But war has already begun, essentially. So I don't think that that's going to happen. But they clearly can do a lot to bolster Iran's defenses and its offensive capabilities. And I assume, and also to help them with intelligence, maybe that was the major failure on the Iranian side, was the deep penetration of Iranian society and government by Mossad and to a certain extent probably by the CIA as well. And that's something they've had obviously some success in uprooting that network, but I'm sure they need to do more. That's a weakness that has to be rectified, and I think they would be foolish not to look for help from the Russians and the Chinese on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of interesting how these other big powers like Russia and China, they don't have something that's counter to really NATO. NATO is the only organization in the world that is this alliance that's constantly expanding. They're like, hey, join our club, join our club. Whereas, we always accuse Russia and China of being expansionists or they're imperialist powers, but they don't have anything like this. It seems very difficult to try to get join their club, be under a military umbrella. They just say, no, we protect our country. That's it. It seems very difficult to sort of form these alliances, whereas the United States is the opposite. If you don't join our club, we'll regime change you and make you join our club.
Yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, and I think it's becoming clear that actually this expansionist NATO doesn't make NATO strong. It actually gives you more liabilities. That NATO all of a sudden has to absorb all the potential conflicts that these smaller countries are involved in, and so is that why maybe Russia and China are reluctant to ever create something like NATO? We had the Warsaw Pact, that's over. There seems to be no desire to do something like that again.
Right. I think they understand that the Warsaw Pact was actually a huge burden for the Soviet Union, for Russia. Back in the Soviet Union. And they don't want to repeat that mistake. I think that's a part of it. There's no question about it. But then also there is this, what they've said openly, I think both the Chinese and Russia, is that we don't want to engage in bloc politics. We don't want to divide the world into blocks. We believe in kind of an open world. That's what BRICS is all about, this multipolar world. That's their vision. And I think they sincerely believe in that. So there is this reluctance to create, a counter NATO. The thing is that NATO itself has a say in that. It's just like you don't want to have an enemy. You don't want to have the world divided. But if NATO insists on seeing you as the enemy and acting accordingly, you just may not have a choice. And I think that's what they're finding. I mean, China in particular was very, very reluctant to be drawn into this, but the continuing, the incessant hostility from the U.S., to China, and and all these very hostile measures that have been taken against China has convinced China that they don't have a choice but to strengthen, to draw closer to countries like Iran and Russia. And it seems amazing to me. I think Iran understood that quite a long time ago. I think it was back around 2010 when Medvedev was president of Russia. The Russians had signed an agreement with Iran to provide them with S-300, air defense systems. But then they started to delay and delay and delay. And why was that? Is because pressure from the West, and Medvedev back then was not the Medvedev that we know and love now. He bowed to that pressure. He wanted to maintain good relations with the U.S. And then, they saw in the end it made no difference. You actually do make these concessions, you accommodate, them, you try to demonstrate that it's reasonable, but there's just this unrelenting hostility. And so they learned their lesson. The Russians did. They learned it the hard way. But now they came to, they went to the Iranians and said, here, we can provide you with a really effective air defense system. And the Iranians refused, because the Iranians under Pezeshkian, I don't think this would have been true under the previous President Raisi, but under Pezeshkian, apparently, this is what reports say, it seems incredible to me, but we've heard similar things about Pezeshkians in reference to other issues. Was hoping to reach out to the West to show they're reasonable, show that they were open to a reestablishment of normal relations. In other words, a normalization of relations, and very foolishly rejected this offer. That, by the way, recent events make me think that helicopter crash that killed Raisi, may not have been just an accident. It's not so much because, Pezeshkian became president afterwards. I don't know that anybody really knew that he would be the president and that he would make these foolish decisions. But just that you saw the penetration of Iran, it was exposed by this Operation Rising Lion. We became aware of it. So that makes you think that maybe it extended to some people associated with that helicopter flight. Anyway, that's just a thought. We'll probably never know for sure, but that's just a thought right there.
Yeah, I think it's becoming increasingly clear to the world that we can't operate with the United States empire. It's not something that can be reasoned with. And it's a dying empire, and that's why it's being so unreasonable. So it seems like the role of the great powers is try to manage this ailing mental patient from causing some type of global catastrophe. So I feel like we are going into this multipolar world. I think it's clear that no matter what happens, the U.S. empire is over. We're watching its decline, and we don't know how it's going to play out. Let's just hope we don't have World War III and we don't have mass casualties across the world. But will we know that this multipolar world will be safer? Is this how do we know that this is going to be a better world? I like to think it will be, because but do we have historical examples or anything that we can say that something that we can hope for in the future once the U.S. empire is going to be done? How will this make the world more prosperous for everybody, more prosperous and safe, like for the United States as well, for the Western empire? Because I think a lot of people that are maybe in the West just have this idea, well, we have to maintain primacy, because if not, then China's going to do all the things that we do, They're going to start doing regime changes around the world, anything our interest, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, China just doesn't have a history of doing that. And Iran doesn't either. Iran hasn't invaded any country. I hear different things, but for at least 150 years. China hasn't launched a war since 1979. That was the attack on Vietnam. And so one of the major problems that China has is their troops don't have combat experience, unlike American troops. They just don't. But even go into deep history, yeah, China expanded, but it was really very incremental. It was at its borders, where in response to attacks. they never became the kind of expansionist power that certain Western countries have been. It's not to say that everything is wonderful about China and its relations with neighboring countries, but they just do not have a history of seeking anything like global hegemony. Now, it's always possible. You just never can say that. Well, sometime down in the future, China might become this. Of course, it could, but that's just not an argument. Just sort of some sort of paranoid fantasies that just might come true. So therefore, we have to do this. I think you just have to look at the at the world that we live in. We don't have any control over what the world may, or we don't have much control or very little control over what the world might be in the future, the distant future, certainly. But we can make sane decisions in the present. And you just look at the actions of this U.S.-led global hegemony, and they have been consistently destructive, not just destructive for the countries that have suffered the attacks, like Iran, or Iraq, or Syria, or Libya, one after another. These aren't just just minor collateral damage, but in the case of places like Syria or Libya, or we're talking about just major human catastrophes, or Iraq. Let's not forget, again, maybe 1 million people dead, millions and millions of refugees. These were horrors, and horrors that were perpetrated by these global hegemonists. And now there are wars in the world that are some terrible ones, for example, in Africa, that really don't fit into that paradigm. But these are the wars, that we ourselves are responsible for. And I don't see any argument for continuing this. It doesn't do us any good. I think in the end, you have to be a realist. Okay, a realist understands that there are always security concerns. There's always a risk of war. But a realist also looks at our current trajectory and understands that this maintenance of hegemony is in fact not possible. And in our own interests, we need to scale back. So again, these people who, insist that we must kind of maintain this control. First of all, you look at the results of their efforts, these are horrible catastrophes, and the blood is on their hands. We can't continue doing this just from a moral point of view. And, but then also they're fundamentally divorced from reality, because the reality is that the world is changing. That dominance that the U.S. that once had, especially in the wake of World War II, is fading, and it's fading ever more quickly. And you can accept it or you can't. If you accept it, you can retire from your position as a global hegemon gracefully. It doesn't mean that the world that will ensue will not have, that there will be no risk of war. There's always going to be. But at least in this matter where we have control, where we've done so much, committed so many wrongs already, we can make a wise decision, and for our sake and for the world.
Do you think we will be able to make this wise decision and pull back and kind of enter the multipolar world as a major player and no longer have this expansionist, imperialist ideology, primacy?
Well, yeah, I have to say it's at least possible, because it seems like these kind of arguments, the kind of arguments that we're making, and many other, let's say, geopolitical dissidents are making, are seeping in, even to, to the administration and to the mainstream. There's still, at the core, of course, things haven't changed. There's still, even under Trump, in spite of that speech that he gave at where was he? Was he in Qatar or was he in UAE? I can't remember. But,
right, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, that speech he gave in the Persian at that Persian Gulf conference, about really the beginning of a multipolar world and the ending of regime change operations. Obviously, he didn't abide by that. He just not too much longer. Just a few weeks later, of course, he launched his attack and started talking about regime change again. But the fact that he gave that speech, the fact that Marco Rubio has talked about multipolar world, these concepts, this understanding is seeping in. It'll take a while, I think, for a real transformation to take shape. But I think the reality just cannot be denied for too long, and you're beginning to see it, like at least it's at the margins, even within these establishments. I just, the big question is, I think inevitably they just have to accept it. You can't maintain this fiction of unrivaled supremacy for forever. Right now it's very hard to, and it's going to be increasingly difficult as the years pass. You can't maintain that fiction forever. The problem is, so eventually there's going to be acceptance of it. I don't think there's any question. It's just like, what are we going to do in the meantime? Are we going to continue to, are we going to lash out, or at some point are we going to begin to scale back, or we begin to, accept the reality? Will that happen gradually? That would be the best thing. Or are we going to, in fact, are we going to be so insistent, our leaders to kind of, rather than accept that reality, they're going to take actions to maintain the fiction. Are they going to lash out in new ways? Are they going to try to demonstrate to themselves and to the world that, no, we are the hegemon? Are they going to launch new wars? Are they going to, attempt to, send troops directly into Ukraine or whatever, because they think that this is they see that, okay, the jig is up. If we let the Russians win, it's over. We're no longer the hegemon. Global hegemony is at stake. Are they going to actually act recklessly and send in troops? These are all possibilities. As the dying throes, you could say, of the empire could have some pretty horrific consequences.
I think one of the big reasons to hope is that, yes, we are lashing out, but as we lash out, every time we lash out, we get a dose of reality that should hopefully be able to come to this conclusion that, hey, we are not the global hegemon anymore, that this goal of primacy is not working. Because we see it in so many instances. Trump talked big with the tariffs with China. What happened? We couldn't flex that economic weight. We tried the same thing with Russia, slap them with all these economic sanctions. Russia's economy is growing faster than anything in the G7. And then, same thing. He's like, okay, well, I'll end this war between Ukraine and Russia. Just got to knock some heads together and then it'll all be done. It didn't work. He can't dictate the terms here. It's not working. This is the same thing with the Iran. Oh, we could do a regime change. Whoops. That didn't work. This attack on Iran clearly did not go as planned for Israel and the West. It's like, okay, well, maybe there's some low-hanging fruit. We can take out the Houthis. Whoops, we can't take out the Houthis either. Yemen. So every single time that they try to lash out, it's like, whoops, okay, this is a reality check for us. We do not have that control. And we've talked about it as well. Just, the moral power that's being lost, the military power that's being exposed to not be as great as it's cracked up to be. And then the economic power, you can see Trump is very scared. He's watching that as well. You had that tweet during the 12-day war, like, keep oil prices low. Don't let this panic, because he knows that the global economy could completely crash if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. Like, there's so many ways that the U.S. is so fragile. China could dump all of its U.S. treasuries, all of its U.S. debt, and just break the dollar. Everything is just, the United States is just holding on by a thread. And every time it tries to use its power, we can see that it is being hanging by a thread, and that it has to back down. It's had to back down in all of these. They want to threaten more sanctions on Russia. Russia's like, we don't care. We try to engage this trade war with China. Who got hurt? The United States. Okay, no more rare earth minerals for you, U.S. The U.S. military industrial complex, its armaments rely on these rare earth minerals. So it's just, maybe the more we do this, we're going to continue to lash out. We got to keep on saying we're number one. We are the dominant power on this planet. But when we try to do that, it just shows that we're not, and it becomes clear to the rest of the world, and eventually the United States, and hopefully maybe we can be humble and say, well, we're still pretty good, but you guys are pretty good too. We're all powerful. And you can almost see Trump doing that. That's the way he almost acts. Like, he goes from like saying, oh, we're going to kill the Ayatollah, to regime change, to, oh, what a hit, we had such a sneak attack, to, oh, Brown, they're pretty good, maybe we could do trade with them, maybe we could do oil, like, oh, they're pretty tough guys, like that's almost like his attitude, so maybe the one thing you can say about Trump is he just changes his mind constantly, so who knows.
Right. Yeah, in a way you could say that he kind of reflects in a very chaotic way the kind of the complete competing
narratives, right?
Right. Within, they all come out with him in a chaotic fashion. He doesn't have his one line, but he just one day he represents one narrative, the other day, or 2 hours later it's the next. I think that's what we can hope for, is that this global hegemonic order will continue to lash out, but hopefully or as everybody will have its dying throes, but each time there is some sort of attack, or a new a new attempt to enforce its will, its weakness will be exposed, but without and will still fall short of the catastrophic scenarios that sometimes we talk about. That's the best that we can hope for. I think actually I think there's reason to be hopeful for that. Let's say, like in the case of Europe, and I think that's what we're going to see. That's my prediction. Is something along the lines of what that's what we're seeing already. We'll see a continuation of that. I think my greatest fear is for the Middle East, because we do just have some, we have a country that just seems to be firmly committed to this expansionist course, and is nuclear armed, and I don't think would hesitate to use those nuclear arms if at some point it finds itself in serious trouble, to the point where there's fears for its continued existence. Again, I think if we want to point to one place in the world where we could see a true catastrophe, a nuclear catastrophe, it's still the Middle East.
So crazy. It's like we're all playing this game of humanity on this planet, and we just have one rogue player that's just going to threaten to throw the whole table over, throw the board over. What's going on?
Don't forget that. I mean, the U.S. and the West are very, very complicit. I mean, actively complicit.
I know.
Right.
But it seems like a lot of it is because of our, the Zionist control of our government and dictating the foreign policy in the Middle East. It's just this. Everybody's arguing, like, is it really Israel that's in control, or the United States is in control? I don't even know if that's the way to look at it. For me, it's almost like it's just kind of one entity. This is part of just U.S. Yeah. Unfortunately, this is what U.S. empire looks like. Is that Israel is a big part of that. That's what it is.
Yeah,
and and it's a feedback loop between the two.
Yeah, well, I think that's basically true.
Yeah. Okay. Well, is there anything else you want to talk about?
I think we've said enough today.
Okay. All right. We'll end it there. I was going to ask you a bit about the New York mayor because everyone's going crazy about it. I don't know if you want to say one thing, or we say that for later.
Well, I'll just say something which is, it probably is maybe irrelevant, but I looked up. I wanted to know more about him, and I found out that he was actually born in the city that I was born in. He was born in Kampala, Uganda. So anyway, that's a connection I have with him. We'll just leave it at that. We can talk about him more later.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Sounds good. Okay, Dad. Have a good rest of your day and a great weekend.
Okay. You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.